before I became a nutritionist, I was an archaeologist. That was my field. I did master's work at the University of Toronto in archaeology. I worked for the ROM. My area of focus even then, when I was doing my archaeology, was focusing on what people were eating. What people were eating back 20,000, 30,000 years ago, even 10,000 years ago here in southern Ontario. Yes, there were people here living around ancient inland seas that are no longer here. And I was digging in Collingwood, of all places, looking for ancient remains. I've also dug in Buffalo, digging up mastodon bones in Buffalo, which was very exciting, very mucky work, but a lot of fun. So I'm going to bring to you today a sort of a melding of my previous incarnation as an archaeologist and now as a nutritionist. So we're going to begin with, first of all, we're going to be talking today about hypoglycemia and how it transitions to type 2 diabetes, and how at the root of all of these conditions is a drastic change in our diet that happened about 10,000 years ago, known as the agricultural revolution. And it changed the way we eat, it changed what we eat, and I will be contrasting what we used to eat and what we're eating now. And unfortunately, when I chose this color schematic for the PowerPoint presentation, I forgot about that light right above the screen. It's hard to read the writing on the title page, but fortunately the print is in black, so it won't be a problem. But it says the role of sugar in the downfall of our health, and that is what I'll be talking about today. So have you all seen or heard of the movie Quest for Fire? Well, this is Quest for Sugar. So 20,000 years ago, imagine you're living in Africa, or you know what, we'll say we're living in Africa, although humans were living in all throughout Europe and in the British Isles and even in North America 20,000 years ago. We had people living in North America possibly even 40,000 years ago. So people have been spreading throughout, but we'll say we're living in Africa for now. So 20,000 years ago, we're out looking, you're a hunter-gatherer. Hunter-gatherer is a lifestyle. This is how all humans lived prior to the agricultural revolution. And the way we lived was by going out. We'd have a certain area that we would use for gathering our food. And today, you and your cousin have been out looking for food and you have found a beehive. There's a lot of excitement because everybody loves honey. But of course, you need to use a smoking branch to stun the bees so you don't get too badly stung. And of course, you do get a few stings, but hey, it's worth it because it's honey. And you don't get honey more than maybe 3 or 4 times a year. This is how uncommon it is to find beehives and also to be able to get that concentrated source of sugar. And what do you do when you get that honey? You and all of your family members in your community, you sit down and you just gorge. You just eat it all. Some of it might get saved. For the most part, you eat all of it because it's too sweet to store, to pass up. So this is what you do. So what are other sources of sugar in this time period? We have honey, which we get maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Fruit is very different now than it is back then. Back then, your apples were much smaller and more tart. Other fruits, we have bred juiciness and sweetness into our fruits. They were not this sweet and this juicy back prior to the agricultural revolution. So apples were small and tart. Berries were, of course, seasonal. Strawberries, has anyone ever had wild strawberries? They're very tiny. They're about the size of a raspberry. They're intensely sweet, but they're scattered. It's hard to gather large quantities at a time. And of course, all of your family members would be involved in the gathering of these fruits. But how often are they available? For very short periods of time, they're available. Even blueberries, raspberries don't store very well. Strawberries don't store very well, but blueberries can be dried, and there are other types of berries that they would dry. But is there a grocery store? The great outdoors is your grocery store. You can't go outside and find things that are available from South America or from other places in the world that have fruits available at different times of the year. You can only eat what is locally growing in your neighborhood. And what about grains? There are definitely grains growing. They're wild. Wild grains are very, very different from the grains that grow today. One of the things that that agriculture has done to grains is it's made the seed heads of the grains more rigid, so that when you're walking through the fields prior to the agricultural revolution, seed heads were very fragile. And this was because the plant needed the animals walking through the fields to knock the grains out of the seed heads so that the grains would fall on the ground and germinate. So the seed heads are very fragile. This is something that agriculture has changed. It's made the seed heads much more rigid, so that walking through or even harvesting or cutting down the stalks of these grains doesn't shake the grains loose. You actually have to work at getting the grains out of the seed heads. So gathering grains in large quantities 20,000 years ago was very difficult to do. You had to be very careful. You had to hold baskets out and very, very slowly work your way through the fields to prevent these grains from being scattered all over the ground, and it's much harder to get them once they're on the ground. So grains, yes, absolutely, they were consumed in very small amounts. What about roots and tubers? Roots and tubers actually provided the largest amount of starch in our diet. Things like sweet potato or yams, lots of different types of roots and tubers. They found archaeological evidence of some of the pollens of these roots and tubers in archaeological sites quite far back in our history. So we know that people were eating them. So for storage, hunters and gatherers, they're migratory. They move around. Depending on the area in which they're living in and how scarce the food sources are, they're going to have to move large distances. So storage of foods is not very sensible, because carrying around large amounts of food is difficult when you're moving all the time. But definitely over the winter, they would be storing foods. And we do have evidence of ceramics as far back as 30,000 years ago, and evidence of them containing grains and various other types of foodstuffs in these ceramic jars. Even evidence of using the grains to be making beer. There's quite early evidence of the use of grains to produce beer. So what are the kinds of things that they are going to store? They're going to be storing the food that contains the most amount of nutrients, the most calories. So we're looking at meat, fat, and bone. And the reason they would be storing bone is for the marrow. Once the marrow is consumed, they can use the bone for fuel. Bone actually burns very hot and very clean, and it makes a very good cooking material, and also for heat. So they would consume the marrow first, which is very high in fat and other nutrients. This is how the human species and our ancestors, dating back for millions of years, this is how we have been living until about 10,000 years ago, when we learned to cultivate grain. Then everything changed. Enter the modern man. Wakes up at 7 a.m., feeling tired and cranky. First thing he does is have a cup of coffee. Got to get the mojo going. What does he have for breakfast? Let's see. There's sugar frosted cornflakes in the cupboard, because that's what the kids like to have for breakfast. There might be some Pop-Tarts in the freezer. He might have that. Oh, a glass of orange juice, because you got to get your vitamin C. So this is what he has for breakfast. He goes to work. By 10 a.m., he's feeling tired. And he's feeling kind of edgy. He's snapping at his secretary. So he thinks, I need more caffeine. I got to bring my energy level up. So he goes down to the food court. He gets himself another cup of joe, and he gets himself a low-fat muffin, because his wife is saying you got to cut back on the fat. But what do they do to low-fat muffins? To replace that satisfaction, that feeling of fat in the mouth, they increase the amount of sugar in those muffins. So they're actually sweeter than the regular muffins. So for lunch, he breaks his resolve to be eating a healthier diet. He just can't bear it. He's so hungry, and he needs that fat. A large fries. So, but he thinks, I'll have a soda instead of the milkshake. It's less calories, less fat. So by 4 p.m., he's tired. Now he's got a headache. He can't concentrate. The screen is looking a little blurry. in front of him, the computer screen. Oh, I'm staring at this computer screen too long, and I'm just feeling so tired. So he's out wandering the hallways and wanders himself to the kitchen, and oh, somebody brought donuts. Yum. So I had some donuts. So by 7 o'clock, he's home. He's having the lovely roast chicken dinner that his wife made with him with the nice skin all nice and crisp. That's his favorite part. He has that. He has a big iceberg lettuce salad with lots of ranch dressing, because what's the point of salad if not to hold the dressing, right? And he has a baked potato with sour cream and a glass of red wine, so he's feeling pretty good. Then around 10 a.m., he's a little wired. Can't fall asleep just yet, and he knows those kids have hidden that Halloween candy somewhere. So he finds the Halloween candy, you know, those little mini chocolate bars, but they don't have many calories, right? They're just little, so he's like 4 or 5, you know. So about by midnight, he's just wiped. He finally crawls into bed around midnight, he crashes. 7 a.m., he's up the next day, and it starts all over again. So does this sound like anyone you know? Does this resemble in any way what we evolved as a species eating? No. This man has some of the typical hallmarks of hypoglycemia. He has fatigue 3 to 4 hours after he eats. He's irritable. He has a headache. He has difficulty concentrating. And he has a craving for sweets. Other symptoms of hypoglycemia are things like anxiety, panic, hunger, heart palpitations, tachycardia, tremor, sweating, weakness, abdominal pain, blurred vision, mental confusion, and impaired memory. Long list. And those are just the non-life-threatening ones. So what is hypoglycemia? There are 2 forms. The form called fasting hypoglycemia, this is associated with pancreatic disease, and for the most part, we're not going to be talking about that one today. We're going to be talking about reactive hypoglycemia. Reactive hypoglycemia is a term that is used to describe an exaggerated fall in blood sugar concentration that results from an excessive release of insulin from the pancreas in response to high carbohydrate meal. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So let's first look at how our body normally deals with sugar. When we consume a meal that contains carbohydrate, now carbohydrate, just so we're clear, includes fruits, vegetables, grains, and anything with sugar. Those are all carbohydrates. You know that sugar comes from either sugar cane or sugar beets, okay? So there is sugar in all of those foods. There's sugar in grains, there's sugar in potatoes, anything that is starchy, anything basically that isn't meat or fat is a carbohydrate, okay? So when we consume a meal that contains carbohydrate, our digestive tract, it extracts those sugars using enzymes and turn it into something called glucose. And glucose is brought into the bloodstream. When glucose comes into the blood, the body responds by secreting something called insulin. Insulin is a hormone, and it comes from the pancreas. And the job of insulin is to tell all of the cells in the body that sugar is available. So insulin will, first of all, it will come to all of the cells in the body, and it will dock in what's called a receptor on the cell membrane of all the different cells in your body. And that sends a message. It's like a doorbell. Ding dong, pizza's here. So your cells are now being made aware that there is sugar available in the blood. And so what the cells do is they send up these things called GLUT transporters or glucose transporters, and they're kind of like tulips. And they come up, it's like they're coming up in the spring, and they migrate to the surface of the cells. And so they surround a molecule of glucose, and they open the door into the cell, and then they open again to the blood, and they take the glucose, and then they close and deposit that glucose down into the cell. And there's thousands of these little tulips all over the cell membrane when insulin docks on the cell, telling the cell that glucose is available. So, as I said, one of the jobs of insulin is to clear the glucose from the blood, okay? So once inside the cell, what does the cell do with glucose? Well, glucose is one of the main molecules that the body uses to produce energy. And we call this ATP. And that is actually the name of the molecule that is produced. It's part of a chemical process called the Krebs cycle that every individual cell has the ability to do this, to produce, except for red blood cells, to produce their own energy. And our brains, for example, a lot of the other cells in our body are able to use fat to produce fuel, but our brain cells can only use glucose or ketone bodies, but for the most part it uses glucose. Glucose is critical for brain function. This is why when your blood glucose levels drop too much, your brain is the first one to feel it, with things like fatigue, headache, irritability, blurred vision, difficulty concentrating, and impaired memory. So these are all symptoms associated with central nervous system function and with brain function. And that's because these cells require glucose for energy. So let's look at what happens when blood glucose falls normally in a healthy body. So if this middle line represents the normal level of blood sugar that helps us to feel good, to keep us from having symptoms. So in a normal situation, when you have a healthy breakfast could comprise of something, a good quality protein, a complex carbohydrate. A complex carbohydrate is a carbohydrate that contains a lot of fiber, okay? That hasn't been refined, that hasn't had all the bran and all of the other components removed from it. So like oatmeal, for example, would be a good example of a complex carbohydrate. Okay, so if you've had a good healthy bowl of oatmeal with perhaps some yogurt, some nuts, and some fruit, or if you have some scrambled eggs and some whole wheat toast, that would comprise a solid breakfast. So if this is what you've had for breakfast, then because there is carbohydrate in the food you've consumed, remember I mentioned that you had toast and also oatmeal. So your blood sugar levels are going to rise a little bit in response to the carbohydrate that you've consumed. So as the blood sugar levels rise, so too does insulin. Okay, so your insulin level is going to rise. In a healthy individual, the amount of insulin that is secreted from the pancreas coincides with the amount of glucose that's being consumed, the amount of carbohydrate that's being consumed. So they're in balance with each other. So the carbohydrate the blood sugar level rises, the insulin level rises, and the insulin and blood sugar levels drop together, and they drop down to what's called homeostasis, or an even level where you're feeling good, okay? Now, if you're going a number of hours without a meal, your blood sugar levels may drop slightly because all of the sugar in your blood has been used up by all of the cells. So the blood sugar level may drop a little bit, but this is where your pancreas comes in again. So your pancreas, it releases insulin to bring blood sugar down. But then when the levels drop, it will release something called glucagon, which talks to the liver. Glucagon talks to the liver. And the reason it does that is because when you've had a lot to eat, your body will store some of that leftover sugar in your liver in a molecule called glycogen. Glycogen is the storage form of sugar, and your body will primarily store it in the liver. It also can store it in some of your other muscle cells. But glucagon primarily speaks to the liver, and it tells the liver, our blood sugar levels are dropping a little bit. Let's bring things up. So glucagon increases blood sugar. And that helps to bring your blood levels up again to a homeostatic level, to a level where you feel fine, until you have a meal, when your levels will go up again. And the process continues throughout the day. Now, if you've started off the day with a good quality protein, a complex carbohydrate, then your blood sugar levels are not going to go too high, and they're not going to go too low. And your body is going to be able to maintain a nice, even level. It's like putting a log on the fire. Right? We've all experimented, I'm sure, with building fires. You put a log on the fire, it burns a good long time, right? You put paper on the fire, it's gone like that, right? Carbohydrates, simple, refined carbohydrates, they're like paper. They burn very fast. They burn hot, you get lots of flame, but then they burn out and you have nothing but ash, right? So complex carbohydrates and good quality protein, that's like putting a big fat log on the fire. If you consume refined carbohydrates, it's like building your fire with paper. It's going to go out and you're going to be left with no energy, okay? So now let's look at what happens with someone like our Mr. Modern Man. So he gets up in the morning, he has his coffee. One of the reasons why we like to have coffee in the morning, coffee also speaks to our body. It speaks to our adrenal glands, and it tells them to release something called cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's one of the reasons why we kind of feel a little like this. It's that fight or flight, that stressed feeling that we get sometimes when we drink too much coffee. But it also is releasing cortisol. What cortisol does is it tells the body to make sugar. To make sugar, and that's what gives you that lift of energy when you drink coffee. It's because cortisol tells the amino acids, tells the body, particularly your liver, to take things like your protein, your muscle cells, if there are no stored amino acids, or it'll use the stored amino acids, and it will use those to make sugar. We can make sugar out of protein. Interesting, eh? So that's what our bodies will do, and in response to caffeine, and that helps to raise our blood sugar a little. That's what gives us that energy boost. So he's burning a little bit of his muscle by drinking coffee, and then he's going to eat that Pop-Tart with the icing on top. You know, the ones that have the little foils of icing that you can spread on top, right? So he's having that, and what happens to his blood sugar? It's going to go really high really fast. Now, one of the things about complex carbohydrates, when you eat them and they have lots of fiber, one of the ways that our body breaks down carbohydrate is with the use of enzymes. When you put fiber in the mix, it kind of interferes a little bit. It slows down the process of turning all of those carbohydrates into glucose. So if you're eating something that has a lot of fiber in it, it's going to slow down that process. Instead of it all being released into your blood at once in a huge surge, it's going to be released a little bit over time. So you're not going to get that huge spike in blood sugar. But this guy's having Pop-Tarts, and I don't think there's much fiber in Pop-Tarts. So he's had a huge surge of sugar and blood sugar. And of course, his insulin is going to shoot up with it. But of course, it's paper on the fire. It's not a good fat log. So his energy level very quickly is going to drop. Now, one of the strange things about our body, particularly with people with hypoglycemia, is that they start out releasing a normal amount of sugar, but over time, when you've consumed a lot of sugar and you've eaten food this way a lot, the pancreas starts to overshoot. It's like too much, and suddenly you've got huge surges of insulin. So instead of just enough, you're getting way too much insulin. And this is why we have this huge drop in blood sugar. Instead of it bringing it down to just below normal, we're actually going way too low. And this is when you start to feel symptoms from hypoglycemia. You start to feel shaky. Your brain is reacting because now your blood sugar level has gone too low. And when the blood sugar levels drops too low, yes, glucagon is being released, but now the adrenal glands are getting involved. And the adrenals are releasing cortisol to try and raise blood sugar again. So over time, of course, and then he has his coffee and his muffin, his blood sugar level goes up again, and of course his pancreas overshoots, releases too much insulin, so his blood sugar drops again. So you can see the pattern of someone with hypoglycemia is quite different. Quite different, yes?
Good question. Does the insulin also follow the dramatic step down? Or?
No, when all of the blood sugar is gone, insulin levels will drop.
Right now, when you went down drastically, what happened to the insulin?
The insulin levels could drop as well. Okay. Yes. Okay. So now you can see the pattern is quite different for someone with hypoglycemia. So what causes this? I think we all know the answer to that now. It's too much sugar, too much refined carbohydrates. They're absorbed too quickly, and the pancreas is overshooting, and now we have a hypersecretion of insulin. And this, in turn, causes the other hormones, the cortisol, epinephrine, the glucagon, even growth hormone is involved to help to bring our blood sugars back up again. But over time, this constant swing of up and down and up and down, it exhausts these organs. And for some people, over time, the organs, they become exhausted, they're not able to compensate. And they're not able to maintain a normal blood sugar level. So other things that can interfere. Now, I mentioned adrenal glands. When the adrenal glands are stressed, and the adrenal glands are important organs for us because they help us deal with stress. Short-term stress, they help us give that surge of energy if we're feeling threatened. And also, in situations where we have family members who are very ill and we have long-term stress or we have a very stressful job, they help to keep us going, the adrenal glands. But they were not designed to maintain, to deal with long-term stress of this kind. So over time, they can become a little bit tired. When the adrenal glands are stressed, the thyroid is like their best buddy. If the adrenal glands are feeling bad, the thyroid is going to start to feel bad. And one of the jobs of the thyroid gland is to tell the liver to make new sugar. And if the thyroid is not functioning very well, this process is going to be interfered with. So the body's abilities to raise blood sugar when it's dropped too low, they're starting to become impaired. The body's not able to do it very well. Other factors that can confuse things are things like food allergies. Food allergies that have not been detected, they can provoke a hypoglycemic reaction. So it's very important if you're dealing with someone who has hypoglycemia, if you yourself have hypoglycemia, some of these symptoms we've been talking about, it's really important to try and make sure that you don't have any undiagnosed food allergies. So what are the long-term consequences of hypoglycemia? Well, difficulty dealing with daily functioning because of your symptoms. You may have difficulty with relationships with friends and family because you have erratic behavior. Okay? You're going to be grumpy. You're going to snap at your children. That might tick off your wife or your husband. You can't blame everything on your hormones. So this can be, you could even lose your job if you're the kind of person who has severe hypoglycemia and you're always snapping at your employees or other people you're working with. It could interfere with your ability to keep your job. So this can have very severe ramifications in the workplace. Also, sugar cravings that go along with hypoglycemia, they can lead to excess calorie consumption and end up with weight gain and even obesity. And PMSC, or premenstrual syndrome, C standing for craving, is also linked to hypoglycemia. People who have PMS that find that they have really strong cravings for carbohydrates, particularly chocolate and sweets, also suffering from headaches and fainting spells. This can be connected to hypoglycemia. And also migraines. People who suffer from migraines, often the root cause of their migraines is hypoglycemia. And when they treat their hypoglycemia, they find that the migraines go away. Something else is aggressive behavior. I mentioned this in regards to your behavior at work, but they've done studies in juvenile detention centers, and they found that when they reduced the refined carbohydrate and simple sugar content of the diet of these inmates, that the aggressive behavior decreased significantly, self-destructive and antisocial behavior in the levels of 90% of all of these participants decreased. And that was just because they changed their diet, just because of that. And finally, the last thing that is a long-term consequence of hypoglycemia is something called Metabolic Syndrome, or Syndrome X. So the slippery slope. So when you have hypoglycemia and you have chronically high levels of insulin being released, over time, this affects the cells. Remember when I said that insulin needs to dock on the cell membrane to tell the cells to send up those little glucose transporters to bring sugar into the cells. Well, over time, with excessively high levels of insulin in the blood, over time, these cells, they stop responding. They stop producing these GLUT transporters, the glucose transporters, and as a result, the cells become what we call insensitive or resistant to insulin. So this is all due to the excessive consumption of refined carbohydrates. And of course, it can also lead to weight gain, because if I'm looking at this gentleman that we talked about eating the Pop-Tarts and the chocolate bars late at night, and he's probably got a high-stress job, guaranteed he's putting on some weight. So he's on his way towards obesity. So further down the rabbit hole, we're now looking at metabolic syndrome. So this is a very complex condition, and it is the next step in impaired glucose management after hypoglycemia. And it's associated with insulin resistance, a high level of circulating triglycerides. Triglycerides is a form of fat that circulates in our blood. It also affects the levels of HDL. HDL, I'm not sure if everyone is aware, it is called a high-density lipoprotein. HDL is the good form of cholesterol. So if you were to go to the doctor and have a blood test, they would be looking at your LDL levels, the low-density lipoprotein, and the HDL levels. HDL cholesterol, it takes excessive cholesterol from our cells and it takes it to our liver, and our liver puts it into our intestines, and then we're able to get rid of it. This is one of the ways the body uses to keep our cholesterol levels at a normal level. So having metabolic syndrome affects the levels of that good cholesterol. So now we're at risk for things like cardiovascular disease. Okay, we're looking at atherosclerosis with metabolic syndrome because we have high levels of circulating fat, and we also have high levels of circulating cholesterol. So metabolic syndrome is typically most often associated with obesity. However, very lean people can get it too, particularly if these lean people drink a lot of soda pop. Soda pop is very high in high fructose corn syrup. Fructose, even though we find it in fruit, but high fructose corn syrup has been associated with causing fatty liver. And even lean people can get a fatty liver. And when you have a fatty liver, you have impaired glucose management, you have insulin resistance, and you also have impaired fat metabolism. And this is what contributes to this soup of fat and sugar and cholesterol that now is circulating in your blood. So when we reach the bottom of that rabbit hole, with obesity and metabolic syndrome, we have the high circulating fatty acids and triglycerides. Studies are focusing more and more on these fatty acids and what they're doing to our cells. And they're finding that it's this high level of circulating fats that is contributing even more to our cells becoming resistant to insulin. I'll talk a little bit more about insulin resistance. When our cells don't respond to insulin, blood sugar levels stay high. Okay? So the body compensates by producing more insulin because the cells are hungry, and they're sending out a phone call saying, I need food. And so the body responds. But there's nobody there to answer the door. The glucose transporters are not there. They're not bringing the sugar in. So the cells are hungry for energy. And the pancreas is responding by sending more and more and more insulin out to compensate. And for the most part, people who are obese, most obese people don't actually develop type 2 diabetes. But they do find that when they look at their blood levels, the amount of insulin that they're producing is much higher than a lean person. But their pancreas is able to keep up with the extra demand. But there are some people whose pancreas is not able to keep up with the extra demand. And over time, this pancreas becomes exhausted. It can't keep up with the amount of insulin it needs to produce to clear all the blood sugar out of the blood. And as a result, it starts to shut down, and the amount of insulin that it produces decreases significantly. And as a result, when insulin levels drop, even though there's blood sugar present, the blood sugar stays high. This is type 2 diabetes. When blood sugar levels are too high all the time, that's type 2 diabetes. Sounds pretty grim. This is what we've done to ourselves. But there's hope. Faulty sugar metabolism and faulty fat metabolism that follows is almost completely correctable with diet. The exception being those people whose pancreatic cells have become too damaged from the high intake of, or the high circulating of fats. It's those fats that are circulating, they actually can cause damage to the cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. So over time, some type 2 diabetics, their pancreas is not able to regenerate and not able to produce the amount of insulin. But even for those people, correction in diet can make their lives much, much better. Believe it or not, the treatment for hypoglycemia, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes is exactly the same. The same treatment. We need to get blood sugar and insulin metabolism under control. So what is our action plan? Step 1, can we all guess what it's going to be? Get refined sugar, flour, refined grains. You have to get them out of the diet. They are the root of the problem. That means white rice, white flour, potatoes, even some whole grain flours are too refined for some people with hypoglycemia. Every time you break down a grain, you're doing your digestive system, you're giving it a break. It doesn't have to work so hard now to get the sugar out of that grain. Okay? So every time you refine a grain, every time you eat oatmeal, that instant oatmeal, you're going to get a hit of sugar much faster than if you were to eat the larger flake oatmeal. It's like the difference between putting tissue paper on the fire and putting, a piece of thick cardboard on the fire. So the more you refine a grain, the faster it's going to release that sugar into the blood. So if you want to eat grains, my recommendation, don't do anything to them. Just cook them. Eat them whole. Don't grind them, don't mill them, don't turn them into flour, eat them whole. Okay? So one of the tricks or one of the tools that people can use to reduce the amount of insulin surge that they're going to have as a result of their meal is to use something called the glycemic index. This was designed for diabetics, and it calculates how much your blood sugar is raised when you consume this food. And it compares it to as if you were to consume pure glucose. So if pure glucose has a glycemic index number of 100, baked potato has a glycemic index of 98. 98. And it's not even sugar. But you know what? Baked potato are so full of starch, it hits your digestive tract. There's not a lot of fiber. Most people just eat the inside, right? The nice fluffy part with butter and sour cream, so good. But you know what? Your body, it turns it into sugar just like that. So another tool that we can use is something called the glycemic load. Now the glycemic load is a mathematical product or a calculation that takes into consideration the glycemic index of a food, the amount of carbohydrate it contains, and also how much is eaten. And the theory being that you eat a small amount of a high glycemic index food, it's not going to raise your blood sugar to the same extent as if you were to eat a large amount of that food. And this glycemic load calculation allows people with problems with blood sugar management, people with diabetes, hypoglycemia, or metabolic syndrome, it allows them to eat small amounts of their favorite foods without throwing the whole diet out of whack. Okay, so I'm going to show you a chart just to give you an example. 10 or less is considered low, 11 to 19 is considered a medium, and 20 and higher is considered high. So here's a list of some of the foods that we like to eat. As you can see, plain white baguette, those nice French sticks, they're so good with pasta, right? Their glycemic index is about a 95, okay? Their carbohydrate content is only about 50%, but the glycemic load is still 48. That's still high, okay? Now let's look at watermelon. Watermelon has a glycemic index of 72. That's still pretty high, but the amount of carbohydrate in it is only about 5%. So its glycemic load number is only 3.6. So what that means is that eating some watermelon is not going to raise your blood sugar to the same extent as if you were to eat some white bread. This glycemic load doesn't take this into consideration, but definitely whenever you increase the fat content or the fiber content of a meal, it's going to reduce the glycemic load number, because now your body has a lot of things in the digestive tract that it needs to work on. It's going to slow things down. Okay? The more you can slow down how quickly that glucose is released into the blood with things like fiber and fat and protein, that's going to help to keep your insulin levels from going too high as a result of a meal. So step 2 of our action plan, eat lots of vegetables. Lean meat. If you don't like meat or fish, if you're a vegetarian, you need to eat a lot of legumes and nuts and seeds. Small amounts of whole grains. You cannot fill your plate with grain, because even though it may be a whole grain, it's still got a lot of carbohydrate in it, and it's going to affect your blood sugar. Okay? So you're going to be eating small amounts of whole grains. You're going to have not lots, but some fresh fruit, keeping in mind that fruit does have a lot of sugar in it, and fructose. Even fruit in high amounts can cause fatty liver, okay? But we're talking a lot of fruit. So, having 3 or 4 pieces of fruit a day is not going to cause you any harm, particularly if you're eating the whole fruit and you haven't peeled off the skin, you haven't turned it into applesauce. Anytime you process a food, you make it easier for your digestion to extract nutrients. Now, while that's largely a good thing, because we want to be able to extract nutrients, if the nutrient that's being extracted more easily is sugar, that's not going to help us, particularly if we have problems with sugar management. Okay? Berries are best. If you're looking for fruit, they typically have less fructose, and they're very high in antioxidants. Berries are great. They're very high in antioxidants, which are going to benefit your body in many, many different ways. So doesn't this diet sound a little familiar? Okay. Does your ancient memory, is it speaking to you here? So this is starting to look like we should be eating what we used to eat. Interesting. So step 3, increase the fiber in your diet. So eating a whole food diet, whole grains, whole fruits, whole vegetables, all of those things are going to increase the fiber in your diet. The fiber, for the most part, it resides in the skins of the fruits and the vegetables. Okay, some vegetables definitely have fiber all the way through, but a lot of the nutrients are in the skins as well. So it's very important that we eat the skins if we can. In addition, it's probably a good idea to consume a fiber supplement like flaxseed. Flaxseed, I can't say enough good things about flaxseed. Freshly ground flaxseed, don't buy it in bulk already ground. This is really, really bad for you. Okay? If you want to buy it pre-ground, buy it in a foil sealed pack and keep it in your freezer. This is because there are special fats called omega-3 fats that are in the flaxseed that are highly reactive. They're like little bombs waiting to go off. They react to oxygen, they react to light, and they react to heat. So anytime they're exposed to any of those 3 things, they're going to become rancid. Rancid fats, really bad for us, really bad for us. Okay, but flaxseed is a beautiful food. If you want to grind it yourself, you can get one of those magic bullets or a coffee blender, anything like that. Grind it yourself, fresh every day. If that's too much of a headache, and it is for me, I grind a bunch all at once, maybe about 2 cups worth, and I keep it in a dark container in my freezer. And then and then over probably 2 or 3 days, I'll consume that, and then I'll grind a bunch again. When the oils are in the whole seed, like the whole flax seed, they're not susceptible to these reactions with the oxygen and the light and the air and the light and the heat. Just one thing before I move on, if you're increasing the fiber, you have to make sure you increase your water. Because if you eat too much fiber and not enough water, what's going to happen? Oh, you're not going to feel good. So make sure you're drinking lots of water. So now let's talk about fat. So fat, we definitely need fat in our diet. We can't live without fat. Our brains are mostly fat. If we don't consume fat, our brains don't function very well. Our nerve cells don't function very well. We get depressed. We have nerve damage. We need fat. We need fat in our diet, but not all fats are the same. So saturated fat, definitely studies are connecting high intakes of saturated fat with insulin resistance and leading to problems with sugar metabolism. Also, saturated fat, they're very long molecules, saturated fat. And you know what, our bodies, they don't necessarily want to work with those to produce energy. It's like coming home with a big fat frozen turkey. You're not going to cook it right away. You're going to put it in the freezer for a while, right? That's what our bodies do with saturated fats. They put them in the freezer, which is our fat cells. That's where they put them, okay? The kinds of fats that our body likes to use right away, they like to consume the short-chain fatty acids like butter. Butter has butyric acid. They're predominantly short-chain fatty acids. Your body uses those for energy pretty quickly. Also, your body likes to use medium-chain fatty acids like from coconut oil. They'll use those pretty quickly for energy. So the kind of long-chain saturated fat is going to be coming from certain types of meat, like those steaks with lots of marbling in them. Yeah, it's got a lot of saturated fat in it, the really long kind that your body, it's going to put in fat storage. So also from palm oil, your body's going to store that pretty quickly. But the shorter ones, like coming from butter, coming from coconut oil, your body, it might store them. If you've eaten a lot, your body can only use so much, and what it can't use, it's going to put away, right? So I'm not saying go ahead and eat as much butter as you want. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that in small amounts, your body's more likely to use that short-chain fatty acid coming from butter for energy than it is for storage. But you eat a whole pound, you know, like Homer with the Good Morning burger. What was that with a 100% whole grain, or not the USDA grade A beef, and then he's got like the egg and the bacon and the big thick pat of creamery butter. Yeah, that's a lot of fat. Your body says, I can't use all that right now. I'm just going to put it all into storage, right? So that's what your body will do. But omega-3 fats, they're a whole different kind of article. These are long-chain fatty acids, but they're called unsaturated, or very highly unsaturated fats. And your body uses those in a very different way. It uses them to build those membranes that are around our cells. Our bodies really like to do that with those kind of fats. What our body does with those omega-3s, it uses it to make brain cells, it uses it to make nerve cells. So omega-3s, our body also uses them to make chemicals that reduce inflammation in our body, which is really great. So omega-3 fats, they're coming from cold water fish like salmon, mackerel. We're also going to get it from flax. Flaxseed, one of the highest levels of omega-3 fats in the plant world. Also walnuts. Of all the nuts, walnuts have the highest amount of omega-3s. Anytime you take a nut out of its shell, the shell is protecting it. You take it out of the shell, you're exposing it to light and oxygen and heat. And what's going to happen to those oils? If you go into a bulk barn and you taste one of the walnuts in that bin, it's going to have an acrid taste. It's going to burn the back of your throat. You don't buy those. They are not fresh. They're bad for you. Okay? The oils have gone bad. First of all, you taste it. If it tastes fresh and sweet and crunchy, and you don't get that burn on the back of your throat, they're probably pretty fresh. Put them in your freezer. Store them in your freezer. Personally, I store all nuts in the fridge. Walnuts I keep in the freezer. Almonds too, yes.
Almonds in the fridge?
Almonds in the fridge, absolutely. Absolutely. Anytime, unless they're in the shell, because the shell is protecting them. You take them out of the shell, it's a free-for-all. So what do omega-3 fats do for us? They reduce our insulin resistance. They do. They make our cells more responsive to insulin. They help with weight loss. They make our cells work better. They take in energy better. They get rid of toxins better. It helps us to lose weight. They protect us from cardiovascular disease. There's so many studies done on the effects of omega-3 fats in cardiovascular disease and how it protects us from atherosclerosis. It can even help to reverse atherosclerosis. It can increase the amount of HDL cholesterol in our bodies. The other thing, it protects us from osteoporosis. Omega-3 fats have a role in building bone. They do. So omega-6, they're coming from vegetable oils. Things like corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, all of those vegetable oils that we've been told are really good for us, they're very high in omega-6. Omega-6 is an essential fat. We do need it. We eat far too much of it. It's in all of the it's in all the packaged foods, omega-6 oils. Studies are not very, they're very conflicting when it comes to omega-6 oils. Some studies say that they don't protect us the way omega-3 does. Actually, most studies say that they don't protect us the way omega-3 does. They may even contribute to insulin resistance. There are some studies saying that high levels of omega-6 oils contribute to osteoporosis. They contribute to cardiovascular disease. They also increase inflammation in the body because they produce something called arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid, we also get this from meat. Why do we get it from meat? What are cows eating? They're eating grains. No, they're eating grains. The more grains the cows eat, the more arachidonic acid is in the meat. Arachidonic acid makes chemicals in the body that cause inflammation. Right? Cows 20,000 years ago, okay, they didn't really look like cows, but they kind of looked like cows. They didn't have the same level of arachidonic acid. They didn't even have the same level of saturated fat that they do now. The meat back then, the fat back then, very different. Actually, the fat of most meat animals that people ate back then, much higher in omega-3s. Because what were the animals eating? They were eating grass and plants. Where do we get omega-3s? We get it from flax, but we also get it from dark green leafy vegetables. That's what the animals were eating. We are what we eat when it comes to fat. Most definitely. Our cells, they're like little contractors. They'd like to build with bricks, but if you give them, sludge, they'll build with sludge. If you give them fat, saturated fat, they'll build your cells with saturated fat. They would rather use omega-3s because they know that's prime building material. They would rather use that. But if you only give them the bad stuff, what choice do they have? They still got to build cells. Okay? So give them the good stuff. Olive oil does seem to have some effect in lowering insulin resistance. Olive oil is different from the other seed oils. It's primarily something called a monounsaturated fat. It reacts differently in the body, not like omega-6. So olive oil does have some connection to lowering insulin resistance and also some diseases. Let's keep moving. So step number 5, we need to eliminate caffeine. If you have hypoglycemia or diabetes, because caffeine has been found to worsen hypoglycemic-induced symptoms. Remember when we talked about how when the blood levels drop, we start to have symptoms? Drinking caffeine, it raises the bar, meaning that when your blood levels drop, maybe this level, now you're having symptoms, instead of having to wait until your blood levels drop this far. It increases the level at which you start to experience symptoms from hypoglycemia. It also stimulates the release of catecholamines or the stress hormones, and these increase the amount of fatty acids that are circulating in the blood. This is not good, right? Fatty acids circulating can contribute to insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes. I'm not telling you if you drink coffee, you're going to get type 2 diabetes, okay? It's probably not a good idea to be drinking coffee. If you already have a problem, caffeine is not going to help you. So alcohol, yes, it's absorbed directly from the stomach. It has a higher glycemic index than glucose, and so it can cause insulin spikes if you drink alcohol. It can also cause a hypoglycemic response because it interferes. Remember I told you that one of the jobs when your blood sugar level drops is for your body to make glucose or make sugar out of amino acids. Well, alcohol interferes with that process, so it can allow your blood sugar to drop even further. Okay, so alcohol, not great. So what can we do about this? So other than changing all of these diets, there are some supplements we can take. Chromium is one of the best supplements out there for people with hypoglycemia. Where do we get chromium? Well, for the most part, it's in the part of the grain that gets refined out when we make flour. It's in the bran. Actually, most of the nutrients of wheat is in the bran. When you take out that, you're left pretty much with starch. All of the B vitamins, all the chromium, the minerals, the zinc, the magnesium, anything that's good about the grain, when you take the bran away, you have nothing left with just starch. Okay? So it's also found in, eggs are a good source of chromium, also in meat. So what chromium is like the doorman. It's a molecule that needs to be there to open the door to let sugar in. So if insulin comes knocking and there's no chromium, there's nobody to open the door. So chromium is one of those molecules that's integral to the process of bringing sugar into a cell. So when people are deficient in chromium, and let me tell you, chromium deficiency is pretty chronic in many parts of North America because it's not in the soil. If there's no chromium in the soil, there's no chromium in the plants. If it's not there for the plants to absorb, then the plants may look healthy, they may taste good, they're nutrient deficient. This is one of the reasons why buying organic. I know it's expensive, but organic is better for this reason because the soil is healthier. They have more nutrients in the soil. When there are more nutrients in the soil, there are more nutrients in the food. It's just the way it works. Okay? So to treat diabetes, the dosages for type 2 diabetes can be somewhere between 800 and 2,000 micrograms per day. For people with hypoglycemia or just insulin resistance, between 200 and 600 micrograms per day of chromium picolinate is a very, very good treatment. It's also been used in treating different diabetic conditions like diabetic retinopathy, also nerve damage, kidney damage. They all treat with chromium, and they've had some very good results. Okay? Another supplement is something called conjugated linoleic acid. This is something that used to be very high in the meats that we used to consume 20,000 years ago, before we started force-feeding them grains. They got their conjugated linoleic acid by eating grass. And so grass-fed beef, if you can afford it, very high in CLA. It's the better kind of meat. I know it's expensive. But it's one of those, you can get it as a supplement, however, and it's been proven to help reduce body fat, to help increase lean muscle, and also to improve the way your body reacts to insulin. It also seems to have some anti-inflammatory benefits and helps to increase how your body burns fat. So CLA is very good to include in a protocol when treating hypoglycemia. So 1,500 milligrams twice a day with food for at least 3 months. So magnesium is one of those minerals. It's the relax mineral. It tells all the muscles in your body to relax. They even use it now, finally starting to use it in hospitals in treating heart attack. They give intravenous high doses of magnesium, and people who are having muscle spasm in their heart, it helps it to relax. My husband the other night was having a really bad toe cramp. Have anybody ever had toe cramps? Magnesium citrate in a glass of water, powdered form, good dose. Within 10 minutes, his muscle spasms were gone. It's a very, very effective treatment. But magnesium is also used by the body in metabolizing sugar and in the way our body uses insulin. So people who are deficient in magnesium, and how do we lose magnesium? If we're drinking too much coffee, if we're under stress, this all depletes our body of magnesium. And so we all need more. So my recommendation, my dosage levels here are fairly low. But for most people, I would recommend that you start at 400 milligrams a day and just start increasing it until your bowels start to get a little loose, because that's a muscle too. It will relax that bowel as well. So women who are pregnant, for example, and suffer from constipation, they take more magnesium. It fixes that problem very nicely. So anyway, if you're getting a little bit too loose, then back off on the magnesium, and that's how much you need. If your GI really reacts to magnesium, you can get it from soaking in a bath of Epsom salts. You can absorb magnesium that way. You can also get something called magnesium oil, which is distilled concentrated seawater. It's a little itchy on the skin. You can cut it half and half with a bit of distilled water. You spray it on your skin, usually the legs. Leave it on for about 20 minutes. Your body will absorb the magnesium, and then you can wash it off. So if you're very sensitive to it in your digestive tract, it's a good way to get magnesium, yes. So zinc is essential for metabolizing blood sugar. Biotin is involved in the action of insulin. This is a B vitamin. I would just say for someone with blood sugar management problems, they're going to need a full spectrum of B vitamins. So get yourself a good B vitamin that has all of them. Don't go for the one that's like 100 milligrams of each one. That's too much. You don't need that much. Get a quality B vitamin that is in balance with each other, and take it 1 to 3 times a day. Okay? So, final recommendations: weight loss and exercise. They are the most effective way to increase your cellular response to insulin. They are the best way to do it, particularly exercise. Losing weight, even a moderate weight loss of 3.5 kilograms over a 2-year period, was associated with an increase in cellular sensitivity to insulin and a 59% reduction in the incidence of diabetes in one particular study. That's huge. And that was just from a little bit of weight loss. They've also done a lot of studies on the effect of exercise on insulin sensitivity. And they found that when you exercise, it increases the number of these glucose transporters that are bringing sugar into the cells. So that will help to reduce your blood sugar and help to bring more energy into the cells. Also, exercise. Remember I was talking about how fats, when they sit around, they go bad? Well, even if they're sitting in your body, it happens there as well. And when people have a lot of circulating fat, particularly where it tends to hang around in the muscles, it goes bad. It becomes oxidized. And when these fats become oxidized in your muscle cells, it damages them. And when that damage happens, it increases the amount that these cells become resistant to insulin. So it just compounds the problem. So exercise, it makes the cells use that fat. And now you've got it circulating. So the fats, even in your muscle cells, are now fresh. And this is all good. It helps to prevent this toxic buildup of bad fat. And resistance exercise, like using weights or walking, or jogging, anything where you're using your own body weight, is going to increase the number of mitochondria in your muscle cells. Mitochondria are the little furnaces in every single cell that makes energy. When you increase the number of mitochondria in the cells, it's increasing the amount of sugar that it uses. It's using more of the sugar, it's burning more sugar, it's making more energy, it's making you feel fabulous. Okay? This is one of the reasons why exercise gives you energy, because it actually makes the machine work better. Exercise, they found in a study that it improved insulin sensitivity up to 24 hours after one session doing resistance exercise. So, final word, we've all heard about bisphenol A, the BPA in plastics and how it's bad for hormones. Well, guess what? They found that in a study they did in 2003, 2004, higher urinary excretion of BPA was associated with a 39% increased risk of diabetes. Yeah, so it's making us sick in many different ways. And final word is how we cook our food. So AGEs, or advanced glycation end products, this is that nice crust on your meat that, you know, in those cooking channels, they all tell you got to get that to increase the flavor. Well, guess what? They did studies on that, and they found that it increases insulin resistance and increases diabetes. Yeah, too bad, eh? So they found that a diet that's low in these AGEs, it decreased the incidence or delayed the onset of diabetes. It decreased inflammation. It decreased kidney damage as a result of diabetes. It increased insulin sensitivity and promoted weight loss. So, how can we cook our meat? Well, roasting of the three bad ones. The three bad ones are frying, broiling or barbecuing, and roasting. Roasting is the one that produced the least amount of the three kinds that are bad. Boiling, poaching, stewing, I know, they don't produce that nice little crust. But if sugar management is a problem, then eating foods that are highly roasted is only going to compound the problem. So if you need to eat them, don't eat them often. Just occasionally. Make sure you're getting your antioxidants. So just quickly before we end, I'll talk about how we cook with oils. So definitely never cook with flax oil, ever. Don't cook with walnut oil, ever. These are high in omega-3s. They're highly reactive. You're turning them into trans fats, essentially. You're making them a damaged fat. When you eat a damaged fat, you damage your cells. The same thing with sunflower oil, safflower oil, corn oil, all of those, any of those polyunsaturated fats are highly reactive. Not as much as flax oil, but they are reactive. Olive oil is the most stable of the liquid oils, and so is butter. Any saturated fat is better to cook with. because it's not as reactive. Saturated fat, it's like, it's not going anywhere. It's not doing anything. So butter is stable, coconut oil is stable. If you like the taste of coconut oil, if you need to cook with oil, that's a good one to cook with. If you want to cook with olive oil, this is what I do. I start out with a little bit of olive oil. If I'm sauteing garlic, I'll do it on a really low heat, just to begin to perfume the oil. I'm not frying it, I'm just heating it. And then I throw in my vegetables like my broccoli or my rapini, and then I put in about half a cup of water. I put the lid on my pan, the water, it protects the oils from damage. You still get the flavor of that olive oil, you still get the flavor of that garlic, but you're not damaging the oil. And you're steaming your vegetables in that liquid. And when it's done, you have a nice sauce at the bottom of the pan, and it's wonderful. You can pour it on top of the vegetables. Okay? So that's a healthy way to cook with oils.